When you think about Pokemon, one of the first things that probably comes to mind is Pikachu, which makes sense, because Pikachu is Pikachu, after all. It's a really endearing and recognizable character with electric powers and all this personality. Not to mention a storied past in the series at large, with all these different portrayals and stylizations across Pokemon's history. But see, I've got this little problem with Pikachu, unfortunately. I mean, yeah, it definitely is pretty cute. I did really like it once upon a time, but I'm 13 now, and I just don't really vibe with this baby stuff anymore. No offense to Ash or anything, but I just can't imagine having a constant partner like this. I feel like there aren't any Pokemon for someone as mature as me, and it's kind of a bummer. But, oh well. Doesn't mean I can't keep watching the movies, though. Okay, now who is that? Whoa. This guy gets it. It's gotta be a new legendary or something special like that, but either way, wow. That's the Pokemon for me. That's where my head was at in 2006, 2007, getting a look at the new Pokemon that were soon to be featured in the next set of games, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. If my mom needed to go to Walmart, I would automatically tag along so I could hit the demo kiosk for these upcoming Gen 4 games. And one of the main reasons was this new character, Lucario. It was so different from what I was used to in terms of Pokemon design. It was still sort of soft and recognizable as a character in the Pokemon world, but there was also a new maturity and complexity to it. There's sort of a darkness and edginess to this design. And there's a provocativeness in the character as well, with it feeling very inspired in some mythological way. Everything about this Pokemon tells you that it's special in some capacity. It's the star of its own movie. It's getting these special cameo appearances in adjacent games and media. It's like a weird legendary or something, or something it was. This is not a legendary Pokemon. Strictly in terms of taxonomy, it is actually quite normal, but through its marketing, presentation, and ultimately community reception, it retains this very stylized half specialness. A generation later, another Pokemon would be unveiled in a remarkably similar way and style to this one, and at this point so many gens later, this type of Pokemon has become its own strange, almost hidden archetype. You could even compare it to a version of Pikachu and its many Pika clones. And so today I want to explore this group and really look at their intricacies and what makes them special in this very unique way. We're going to go through the series generation by generation, looking at and breaking down what I'm calling Pokemon's edgy fake legendaries. Let's dive in. Today, there are lots of Lucarios running around in the Pokemon world, but to really quantify the phenomenon and look at the first real instantiation of the type, we're of course going to start by analyzing Lucario itself. There were some Pokemon that could be considered vaguely in this category in previous gens, like look at Mons like Gyarados or Absol, but none with the intentionality and mass demographic appeal like Lucario. I really love this design so much. On one hand, it's so plainly cool, but is also accompanied by all this design depth. I can see both Pikachu and Shadow the Hedgehog in this design. The edgy older brother is very intact here. I also give a lot of reverence to the idea that Lucario as a character was primarily inspired by the Egyptian god Anubis, and so there's an additional thematic darkness present here as well. But all in all, this is a special Pokemon, even if it isn't a legendary, and this came squarely as a result of Pokemon's presentation of it as a character, and how that presentation was ultimately consumed by the fanbase. This is the case with all of these Pokemon, but I guess I think Lucario is extra special because it was the first time this conversation was able to happen. Way before it was playable in any game, it was given this movie that really propped it up as a bit of a rougher, more jaded hero, and you can kind of see shades of Seto Kaiba or Vegeta in Lucario's hesitancy to trust over the course of the story. Still before its official release when players could actually use it in-game, Lucario was this borderline mythological figure in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue and Red Rescue Team. The great adventurer Alakazam, who within the story is already considered the big boss of rescue teams, will tell you about the lurking legend of Lucario, described as having had the greatest adventures of all time. This was really the one that did it for me, because you only hear secondhand accounts of this mythical figure in the rescue team world, and are at most given the ability to gaze upon a statue of the character. You never actually meet him. There's an indescribable mystique imposed on the player through this portrayal, especially so because the scope of the game's Pokemon covers every legendary up through Gen 3. Those Pokemon are very much still special, but you can ultimately recruit them like all the rest, which for me put Lucario on this much higher pedestal. This is a character to maybe be interpreted as beyond legendary. Closer to Diamond and Pearl's official release, and like I mentioned at the beginning, players could try out the game's demo at select retailers, with those who did getting to pilot, you guessed it, Lucario, as you battle against a few trainers next to Jubilife City. For one, this is just an extremely cool demo. Like any good first look, there is so much cool pre-release content here where you get this snow globish view of the Sinnoh region, but most importantly, you get to fight with Lucario. Now granted I was 9, but I once again found it very provocative because of the moveset that it has. A cool new fighting type move with an awesome animation, this attack with a giant bone, but also 2 trickier moves in Me First and Metal Sound. What sort of Pokemon is this? How does it move? What sort of role does it have? They laid all this framework that was ripe for the imagination to just go wild with this demo. And finally, push come to shove, it all panned out. Lucario was the image of cool in Diamond and Pearl, being exclusively tied to the dashing adventurer Riley. There are no wild Lucario or its pre-evolution Riolu in Sinnoh. You receive an egg of one from Riley after playing through a dungeon with him. I think it would be fair to consider this sort of an archaic method to obtain a Pokemon like this. Riley is sort of late into the game, and because you get it as an egg, there's also a bit of work to be done to use Lucario in the way you're probably imagining. But for a reward as cool as Lucario, this is something I always go for. And just in strictly mechanical terms, Lucario delivers. I think its move pool especially sells it as the edgy faux legendary. Aura Sphere, Close Combat, Dragon Pulse, Extreme Speed, cool as a freaking cucumber, and with plenty of power to back it up. Lucario was an absolute smash hit. The Pokemon would hit the big leagues soon after Diamond and Pearl, getting added to Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and the rest is history. Lucario is to this day one of the most beloved Pokemon out there, being voted the second most popular of them all in 2020's Pokemon of the Year vote held by the company. Wait, second? Who could have beaten Lucario though? Oh, nothing to see here, folks. I don't really want to talk about that guy, sort of outside of the scope of this essay, so to speak. So let's just keep moving. The next one of these Pokemon would be seen in 2010 as a part of the build-up to the next set of games, Pokemon Black and White. The Dark-type Zoroark and its pre-evolution Zoroark will be revealed to players in a very similar way to Lucario before it. Pre-release hype, its own personal movie at the tail end of Gen 4, and a shadowy but still lovable design based on a mythical character. Another Pokemon with this legendary intent that blurred the lines for players newly interpreting it. I have a lot of reverence for this design and characterization because not only does it really hit in all the right Shadow the Hedgehog ways, but there is also overt and tangible malice radiating from this Pokemon in an almost eerily human way. The bent knees and crooked smirk, the power of illusions. This almost feels like an enemy, but it still really works. I don't think they pushed the envelope to the point of breaking at all, and I've always had a super soft spot for Zoroark because of it. But a lot of that probably comes from Zoroark's fascinating story implementation in Black and White. The Pokemon is actually not accessible at all in the game's main story, and despite not being a legendary or mythical, it's instead uniquely event exclusive. And even further, it was the result of a cross-generational event. You could receive shiny versions of Raikou, Suicune, and Entei through a distribution in Gen 4, and then when transferred to Black and White in Gen 5, these Pokemon could be taken to Lostlorn Forest to trigger a battle with an angry Zoroark that you could then catch and add to your team. And just like every other one of these special in-game mini-stories for a special Pokemon, it's a magical experience. In the back of Lostlorn Forest, a woman comes out from a trailer, snarls violently, and then attacks you. In the actual battle screen, you're strangely facing off against one of the legendary beasts. But after taking a hit, the illusion breaks, and there it is. It's Zoroark. But what really strikes me about it is what you see afterwards. Because after a successful capture, the dense forest you were standing in becomes this wide, open, flowery clearing. The forest itself was an illusion created by Zoroark's influence. It's pretty much entirely a visual thing though, as the story you're going through here is very much based around the points of the movie, namely Zoroark clashing with the shiny beasts. So there's not any real thematic depth to it, I suppose, but it's always cool for anime material to receive any semblance of canonization like it did here. The Pokemon did take on a bit of a story role in Black 2 and White 2 though, being very closely linked to the character N, seeming to be something of a confidant for him. So there very much is still something here that stands by itself. In actual use, Zoroark is so unique and sharp feeling. Its ability Illusion has it enter fights as whatever Pokemon you have in the back of your party, and then its moveset is so wide and varied it can look good doing just about whatever you want it to. It's a model not so legendary in every way. Moving on to Gen 6, things would start to take an interesting turn for these types of Pokemon. No, this is not about you. So as I was saying, Gen 6 was going in brave directions with his characters. Stop. You are a starter. It is not your turn right now. So players would be shown this Pokemon Aegislash and then... Oh my goodness. Fine. Okay. I submit. It was always unlikely I could get away without talking about this, so let's just do it. Let's talk about Greninja. Greninja was, is, and always will be an experience. From the moment it was revealed up until the present day, it has been one of the most, if not the most popular Pokemon out there. Greninja looks and feels like it was scientifically engineered to take everything that was good about Lucario, crank it up to 11, and then create this unbelievable super mascot of legend. While maybe not as legendary feeling on account of it being a starter, Greninja is the edgier, older kid mascot in Pokemon, and its presentation, treatment, and ultimately reception by players puts it firmly in this grouping. And who am I to deny it? This Pokemon is unbelievably cool. It's a lanky ninja frog that hops around and throws shurikens made of water. Definitely might be reaching a point of saturation, but it deserves the respect. Greninja does not have its own movie like Lucario and Zoroark do before it, but true to its nature, Greninja would patiently bide its time and ultimately receive so much more. Like Lucario, Greninja would be drafted as a character for Smash Bros. On the Wii U and 3DS. I mentioned this first thing because it was chosen before Gen 6 had even been officially released. Sakurai and the Smash team only had concept art to go off of for making a completely fleshed out fighting game character, which makes me think, at least, that they knew, and had at least some confidence that this character could be the second coming of Lucario, of Charizard even. Actually, in the Pokemon games, Greninja was immensely powerful, an unbelievably strong and fun to use hidden ability with game warping power and Protean, which changes the user's type to the type of move it's about to use in battle, an incredible stat line, and a move pool that could let it perform practically any role were all working in tandem for this one Pokemon. It was fun to use during the main story, and had value competitively. By all metrics, it was a complete smash hit. But while players around the world were making their way through the Kalos region with Greninjas of their own, there was one trainer in particular having a journey unlike all the rest. The Pokemon anime, historically, has been very formulaic in nature. The structure began to get a little looser in the 7th generation with Sun and Moon, but up until that point, every generation would follow Ash and Pikachu make their way through the 8 gyms, and then lose in some frustrating way during the Pokemon League tournament. But the bond between Ash and Pikachu as day 1 partners would always persevere. The Gen 6 anime, however, would at a certain point see Pikachu take a back seat to another Pokemon who would somehow develop a closer bond with Ash, one so close that it would result in a new form for the Pokemon. And I'm of course talking about Greninja, and its brand new Ash Greninja form. In short, Ash would develop this sort of spirit bond with Greninja that would unlock never before seen power for the Pokemon when they would mentally sync up. The form would be compared to Mega Evolution, which was the new big thing at the time, but wasn't exactly the same thing. It was a phenomenon all of its own, just for Greninja. And while it wouldn't immediately happen in Gen 6, Ash Greninja would actually make it to the games proper in Gen 7, more canonization of anime concepts, and players would be able to pilot it just like Ash had done on the show. And this Pokemon, Ash Greninja, is a monumental occurrence. Greninja defied all the rules and stepped over Pokemon's eternal golden boy for a season of the anime, and was so series warping it even canonized Ash to the actual games in a roundabout way. The exact details of which are hazy at best, but come on, it's called Ash Greninja. It looks like this, and I can use it in a game. All put together, Greninja transcended the existing Pokemon structure and then redefined it in its own image, something that can only be described as legendary. Now, while Greninja did have the staying power to extend into Gen 7 Sun and Moon, I still do want to talk about a character in these games. After Greninja, the archetype would take an especially grim and shadowy turn with one of Pokemon's darkest characters yet. Let's talk about type Null and Silvally. These two are incredibly unusual Pokemon, type Null especially. There's something particularly brutal about these designs you don't see very often in this series. It's not that we don't have technological Pokemon, but to have them combined in this very unnatural way, there's a story being told just through the visuals. I see these Pokemon as something of a darkened version of the Lucario archetype. This shadowy beast was given some major story attention in the Generations games and anime, paired with a grumpy yet lovable rival, and given some pre-release hype. But despite all the evidence to the contrary, this Pokemon actually is a legendary. Type Null works so well for me because the Pokemon is inextricably tied to a major story character. Lucario has a pretty cool connection with this guy Riley, but in story terms he is ultimately very far off the beaten path, serving kind of a character of the week role as you journey with him in a specific dungeon. Type Null, however, is a direct association with one of Sun and Moon's main characters, a rival even, which further inserts you as the player into the fold as a spectator for this darker than most creature. Type Null began as an experiment, an attempted project at creating a weapon that could slay the fearsome Ultra Beasts, dangerous extra-dimensional beings. In order to act effectively in this role, the Slayer would need to be able to wield a myriad of powers, or at least shades of them, and it would need to operate at a higher level than the average Pokemon. The project would research the world's myths at the Canalave Library in Sinnoh, and ultimately they would use this research to create the RKS system, a type-switching interface for the Slayer built in the image of a fabled god. Taking DNA and parts from all different types of Pokemon, the Slayer would be fabricated as a chimera in the god's image. A creation you could perhaps even call an edgy, fake legendary, but one of a different breed than those that came before it. The experiment seems to have been doomed for failure, however, as the Slayer was far too violent and volatile to see use as intended. The type-switching interface was too much for the creature. The glorious Type Full, named for its theoretical ability to wield powers of every Pokemon type, was fitted with a specialized muzzle and then cryogenically frozen. Now called Type Null, the three Slayers that had been created rotted away, their creation an affront to life, and perhaps even God itself. If you can believe it, that's just the beginning for Type Null. This intricacy and depth of lore is amazing to me because it comes from this series that is usually so bright and colorful on the surface. And I guess a part of that is that they're still able to weave a beautiful and hopeful story through this character. Ultimately, after busting out a Type Null from its cryosleep, your rival Gladion, on a shadowy quest of his own, embarks on a journey with Null to subvert a destiny that was created for him by his mother. It might be one of my coolest moments in any Pokemon game when you fight Gladion before heading to the Pokemon League. Through his journey of self-discovery and healing, not only has he been able to grow into his own person, but Type Null has overcome the need for the helmet, and fights alongside its friend in full control of the RKS system. Before this, you and Gladion are borderline enemies, but in this fight, the born-again Silvally, a name given to it by Gladion to replace Type Full, stands proudly in front of you as the type that's strong against your starter, the mechanical sign of a true rival, and further as a mark of metamorphosis and healing. Two damaged souls that were able to create something greater together. And it's just beautiful. This story surrounds me with beauty. I feel like they really tested the limits of this type of Pokemon. They played with a semi-established formula and with player expectations to tell this dramatic epic between an edgelord Pokemon and an edgelord trainer. I think ultimately the designs are what keeps this evolution out of mind. It's so jagged and grim, it's not really fit for a complete mascot. But if I was going to pick my favorite Lucario, this one would definitely have to be it. After Gen 7, the lines start to blur a little bit on who is the exact character of this archetype. There are a lot more possible Pokemon in this vein, and so it's a lot more subjective. But while I think things are a lot more interpretable and up in the air in regards to who exactly these generations Lucarios are, the beauty in this shadowy archetype is that it completely hinges on community reception, and the existence is a result of a conversation between Pokemon and a growing player base. So I think it's cool now to see multiple interpretations and shades of the character across several designs. But for the purposes of this essay, I'm going to narrow it down to one. I think they really fit, but if you've got your own, feel free to leave them down below. For Sword and Shield especially, it feels like there were a lot of characters on the border of this grouping. Pokemon like Obstagoon and Surfetts come to mind as cooler characters that received a lot of press before and during the game's release, but they're both too thematically specialized to Britain for me, and happen to be regional forms of already existing Pokemon. All of which brings my eyes to Toxtricity, a sort of laid-back, punkish design, a baby evolution just like Lucario, and a dynamic typing and theme that makes way for a ton of interaction and battle. It definitely looks the part. I really like all the dynamic effects on Toxtricity too. Seeing a static image of it doesn't do it justice when it's so lively in game. The design feels really cared for. This one feels weaker to me, at least, because that's where the connections mainly stop. It's got a light involvement with a major story character in Piers, and was given a special Dynamax form, but it's definitely missing that higher mythos or adventure the archetype usually subscribes to. And then finally, with the most recent generation, for now at least, we've got another change to the formula with a branched evolution. So far Ceruledge and Armarouge haven't had a huge amount of time in the sun, but they so clearly line up with the visuals of this role, and it goes a long way to make them feel special. Ceruledge especially, that's the one I'm picking. It's a dark and brooding ghost flame sword fighter, for crying out loud, and the original trailer it was featured in kinda gave it that air of being something a bit more. Ceruledge is getting a bit of that attention on the new Gen 9 anime series, and it along with Armarouge are part of a very small roster of Gen 9 Pokemon that are playable in Pokemon Unite. So they're definitely at least a little special. But once again, I don't have a huge amount to say with this generation either because of the half-specialized in-game story role the archetype is known for. And it seems to have kind of dropped off to just being a visual theme in certain characters, if anything. And I just think it's neat. This archetype and others like it are some of the neatest things this game can offer us as players and as a community. Pokemon frequently involves itself with community expectations of the game through the use of official taxonomy and vocabulary, classifications like Legendaries or Mythical. But there are plenty of community-made categories that only exist through a collective conversation and wide-ish agreement on the commonalities between characters. And I think this one, the edgy fake legendary type, is so important and my favorite because it's such an intricate and deep classification. And the ways that we as players are given and then interpret those details is such a cool thing to watch unfold. Bottom line though, I'm 13 now, and these Pokemon are awesome. That's all I got for you this time, folks. Let me know what you thought down below, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and I will see you all next time. Droomish out.